April 29, 1945, Bavaria. The gates of a small German camp creaked open under a sky the color of cold iron. American soldiers, exhausted and mud-streaked, stepped cautiously inside. The air smelled of rust, ash, and something that clung to the skin. Months of unwashed life. From the shadows of a wooden barrack, a group of women emerged. They moved slowly, uncertain if the men in khaki were real. Their uniforms were long gone. Their hair was cropped short, their faces hollow but defiant. For a long moment, no one spoke. One American medic knelt, opened a supply crate, and pulled out bars of soap wrapped in brown paper. Another handed out clean towels, shaking hands as he did. The women stared in silence. Some began to cry. Others simply pressed the soap to their faces, as if afraid it would vanish. For them, it wasn't just a gift. It was proof that the nightmare was ending. The war, however, had not ended its reach. By the early years of World War II, millions of men were already prisoners. But few realized that thousands of women, nurses, relief workers, resistance fighters, and civilians would soon share their fate. When Germany swept across Europe in 1939 and Japan advanced through Asia in 1941, the traditional rules of war dissolved. Civilians, especially those connected to Allied forces, became strategic hostages. In places like Singapore, the Philippines, Poland, and France, entire groups of women were rounded up, questioned, and confined behind wire fences. Some were military nurses caught when bases fell. Others were missionaries or teachers accused of espionage. Many were local women who had aided Allied soldiers or passed coded messages in resistance networks. By 1942, camps designed for male prisoners began to take in women. The Nazis called them protective custody, a term that hid the brutal reality. In the Pacific, the Japanese Imperial Army set up internment centers in Los Baños, Santo Tomas, and Palawan, where Allied women lived in extreme deprivation. Conditions varied by region but shared one cruel pattern: overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Many of the women were moved across countries as front lines shifted, enduring days packed in train cars or ships without water. When they arrived, they found themselves behind walls lined with barbed wire, under guards who viewed them with suspicion or contempt. Reports from Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in Germany, described a daily routine of fear. The women rose before dawn, counted in the cold, and marched to forced labor, assembling weapons, digging trenches, or sewing military uniforms. They were fed watery soup and scraps of bread. Letters were rare, medicine non-existent. Yet even in this cruelty, fragments of humanity appeared. A French nurse smuggled antibiotics under her clothing. Dutch women taught each other songs to keep their spirits alive. British internees in the Philippines formed secret hospitals using stolen gauze and improvised tools. For many, the most terrifying part wasn't physical punishment, but the slow erasure of identity. Their names were replaced with numbers. Their past lives, families, professions, hopes became whispers remembered only in the dark. News of their suffering rarely reached home. Allied governments knew little about the conditions, relying on fragmented Red Cross reports or intercepted letters. For the prisoners, liberation felt like a distant idea, something for other people, in another world. But as 1944 turned into 1945, that distant idea began to move closer. Allied armies advanced across Europe. In the Pacific, American forces pushed toward Luzon and Okinawa. The world that had shrunk to the size of a camp fence began to tremble. Inside those barbed wire perimeters, whispers spread. The Americans are coming. The women didn't dare believe it. They had seen too many false dawns. Yet something in the air, rumors, gunfire, the fading discipline of the guards, told them that history was shifting. The world beyond the wire was changing, and soon its footsteps would reach them. By early 1945, across Europe and the Pacific, the situation inside the camps had reached a breaking point. Supplies were collapsing, disease was spreading unchecked, and both guards and prisoners knew the war was slipping away from the Axis powers. In Germany, Allied bombings cut rail lines and supply chains. Food shipments to camps slowed to a trickle. At Ravensbrück, the daily ration was reduced to a crust of bread and a ladle of thin turnip soup. Prisoners fought over potato peels. Lice, dysentery, and typhus claimed hundreds every week. Yet, through exhaustion and illness, many women refused to surrender their will to live. Testimonies from survivors describe quiet acts of defiance: a smuggled prayer, a torn scrap of paper with a poem, or a nurse secretly treating the sick with stolen medicine. In Poland, women from the underground movement shared their rations with strangers. In the Philippines, captured American nurses called themselves the Angels of Bataan, tending to wounded men even while starving. But cruelty had many forms. Punishments were arbitrary. A woman could be beaten for not standing straight, for hiding a blanket, or for helping another prisoner. At Ravensbrück, female SS guards, some barely in their 20s, carried out orders with cold precision. In Asia, the Japanese camps enforced strict obedience. Any act of defiance was met with violence. Letters home, when allowed, were censored into fragments. Many families had no idea their daughters or wives were even alive. The Red Cross made sporadic visits, but their access was limited and carefully staged by the captors. To the outside world, these women were shadows behind propaganda. Still, even under control, news filtered through. By early 1945, the sound of artillery grew closer. Guards spoke in whispers. Some began burning documents. The women noticed trucks leaving in the night, carrying crates instead of food. The air carried rumors of Allied forces in France, of Russian troops moving west, of Japanese retreat in the Pacific. For the prisoners, time had become strange. Each sunrise was a small victory. Each night survived was another chance to see the end. They counted liberation not in days, but in heartbeats. In one German camp, an American reconnaissance plane appeared overhead, its engine droning like a promise. The women waved torn pieces of clothing, but the pilot couldn't see them. Still, hope ignited. "They know we're here," one prisoner whispered. Meanwhile, across the world, American troops closing in on Los Baños and Santo Tomas had learned that hundreds of Allied women were being held by Japanese forces in near-starvation conditions. Planning their rescue became both a tactical and moral mission. The camps, designed to break the human spirit, had instead revealed something else: endurance. These women had survived hunger, humiliation, and the collapse of civilization around them. They were more than victims. They were witnesses to humanity's extremes. As the front lines reached the gates of those camps, liberation was no longer a rumor. It was a matter of days. Soon, the world would see what those women had endured, and how something as ordinary as a bar of soap could symbolize the return of dignity. 1. The human angle. Bonds that defied the war behind the wire. Nationality lost its meaning. British, Dutch, Polish, and American women shared a single identity: prisoners. Hunger and fear stripped them of everything except one another. In that emptiness, a quiet solidarity formed. At Ravensbrück, prisoners remembered how older women helped younger ones survive their first winter, teaching them how to wrap torn rags around their feet to stop frostbite. In the Philippines, the Angels of Bataan rationed their meager soup by sharing it in equal portions, no matter rank or background. A nurse later wrote, "We learned that survival depended on someone else's courage as much as our own." These small acts of kindness became resistance in themselves. They whispered songs in native languages, smuggled bread under coats, and shared information from guards' conversations. Even a smile, something forbidden, became a quiet message of defiance. Such bonds were not born of comfort, but of necessity. The camps had taken everything but left one fragile thread unbroken: compassion. In a world built on cruelty, that compassion was a form of power. And when liberation finally came, it was that same human bond that helped many women step forward, stand tall, and reclaim their names. The tactical angle: how the Allies found them. Finding these camps was not simple. Many were deliberately hidden, moved frequently, or disguised as civilian facilities. By 1944, however, Allied intelligence had begun piecing together a grim map. In Europe, aerial reconnaissance revealed clusters of barbed wire near industrial sites, signals that caught the attention of analysts in London. Intercepted German communications hinted at female labor detachments in northern Germany and occupied Poland. Resistance groups on the ground risked their lives to pass coordinates and survivor lists to Allied command. In the Pacific, the intelligence process was even more urgent. American forces advancing toward Manila received reports from Filipino guerrillas and escaped internees describing the conditions at Los Baños and Santo Tomas. Some of the information reached General Douglas MacArthur, who authorized one of the most daring rescue missions of the war, a combined parachute and amphibious assault designed to free over 2,000 prisoners in a single strike. These operations were more than tactical maneuvers. They were moral imperatives. Commanders knew they weren't just saving soldiers, they were rescuing civilians, many of them women who had served their countries in silence. And when those first camps were liberated, the intelligence officers who walked through the gates realized the full weight of what they had uncovered. The humanitarian angle, the Red Cross, and the world's conscience. The International Red Cross served as the fragile thread connecting prisoners to the outside world. But even this organization, bound by diplomacy and restricted by Axis rules, struggled to pierce the walls of secrecy. In Europe, Red Cross parcels, when allowed, contained powdered milk, sugar, and sometimes chocolate. Yet many female camps were excluded from these deliveries entirely, categorized as non-military or civilian internment centers. For the women inside, that distinction was meaningless. They were starving either way. In the Pacific, the situation was even worse. The Japanese government permitted almost no external aid. Red Cross messages were often delayed by months or blocked entirely. Relief ships were sometimes sunk in transit, or their cargo redirected by the military. Still, volunteers and local aid workers persisted. In Switzerland, women packed care boxes without knowing who might receive them. In the Philippines, Filipinos risked execution by smuggling rice and medicine through the wire. When liberation came, Red Cross teams followed closely behind Allied troops, documenting malnutrition, recording names, and providing the first real contact between survivors and their families. Their reports later became crucial evidence in war crimes tribunals. For many women, the sight of a Red Cross armband after years of captivity was almost as shocking as the soldiers themselves, a symbol that the world hadn't forgotten them. Even as the war's front lines shifted, these different perspectives, human courage, tactical precision, and humanitarian persistence, converged toward the same point: the moment of liberation. And when that moment came, it would reveal not only the brutality of war, but the quiet resilience that survived it. The leadership angle: choices at the edge of war. When Allied troops began liberating camps in 1945, many commanding officers had no idea what they were about to encounter. Their maps listed military targets, depots, rail junctions, supply roads. Few expected to find skeletal prisoners behind those fences, and even fewer were prepared for the sight of women. In General George Patton's sector, American units advancing through Bavaria stumbled upon subcamps of Dachau, where both male and female inmates were held. The decision on how to proceed rested with field commanders who were trained for combat, not humanitarian crises. They had to make rapid choices, whether to pursue retreating German forces or to stay and tend to the dying. Some officers split their units, sending medics and chaplains into the camps while combat troops pressed on. Others halted entire advances to secure medical supplies and food. A few ignored orders to wait for higher command, acting on instinct and conscience. Reports describe how soldiers broke into nearby German warehouses to find blankets, soap, and canned rations. One American colonel later wrote, "We weren't liberators that day. We were witnesses." These moments of leadership were not about tactics or strategy. They were about humanity at its most basic level. The decision to stop fighting long enough to heal. The psychological angle. The shock of liberation for the women inside the camps. Liberation was not immediate relief. It was confusion, disbelief, and sometimes fear. After years of hunger, disease, and abuse, many couldn't comprehend that it was over. When American soldiers entered Los Baños and Ravensbrück, witnesses described scenes of stillness. Women stared at the men in uniform, expecting punishment rather than rescue. Some refused food, convinced it was a trick. Others fainted from the smell of real bread. The gesture that gave this documentary its name, soap and towels, came from simple compassion. Soldiers wanted to restore some dignity before medical evacuation began. But for the prisoners, that moment carried deep emotional weight. Soap meant cleansing. Towels meant ownership of one's body again. They were symbols of being human. Psychologists later called this reaction liberation shock, a mixture of relief and paralysis that followed trauma. Many survivors cried uncontrollably. Others went silent for days. A few couldn't remember their own names, yet even in their fragility, they showed extraordinary strength. Within hours, some volunteered to help medics, distributing food to others weaker than themselves. Survival had become a collective act, even after the gates were open. The cultural angle. What the world saw and what it didn't. When the war ended, the stories of male soldiers and concentration camps filled newspapers and newsreels. The suffering of female POWs, however, remained largely in the background. Many survivors were too weak to speak, and others chose silence, unwilling to relive what they had endured. In America and Britain, newspapers briefly reported the liberation of Allied nurses and civilians from Japanese and German camps. Photographs showed smiling faces and waving flags, but rarely the true extent of the suffering. Society wasn't ready to confront what had been done to women in war. It wasn't until decades later that detailed memoirs began to surface. Diaries from Dutch and Australian nurses, testimonies from Polish resistance members, and Red Cross reports that documented starvation and forced labor. These records revealed a fuller picture. Women who had served, resisted, endured, and survived. Historians now view their experiences as vital to understanding the moral scope of World War II. The war wasn't only fought on battlefields, it was endured in silence by those whose courage left no medals or headlines. Their stories remind us that victory alone doesn't define history. Memory does. All these perspectives, leadership, psychology, and culture, merge into a single moment that would change how the world viewed both heroism and humanity. That moment arrived with the sound of boots, the creak of a gate, and the sight of soap and towels in American hands. April 1945. Bavaria, Germany. The front lines had fractured. German resistance was crumbling, but chaos still ruled the countryside. Villages burned, refugees flooded the roads, and the air carried the dull thunder of artillery. In the midst of it all, American patrols followed rumors, whispers from villagers, fragments of intercepted messages. about a camp hidden in the woods near Landsberg am Lech. When the soldiers reached it, they found barbed wire, guard towers, and rows of wooden barracks half sunk in mud. There were no gunshots, no guards shouting, only silence. A medic described it later. It looked empty, but the smell told us it wasn't. They advanced cautiously, rifles ready. Inside the first barrack, they found women, hundreds of them, too weak to stand. Some were sitting on straw-covered floors, others lying still under thin rags. Their eyes followed the soldiers without expression. It took a moment for anyone to speak. An American sergeant took off his helmet, knelt beside a woman who looked barely alive, and offered her his canteen. She stared at it as though it were a mirage. When she finally drank, tears ran down her cheeks. Nearby, a corporal opened a supply bag and pulled out something simple, a bar of soap wrapped in paper. He handed it to a prisoner. She held it like a sacred object. Another soldier passed out towels, their edges frayed from months in his pack. The women clutched them to their chests, whispering words the soldiers couldn't understand. They had not seen soap in over a year. Many hadn't washed since the last rainstorm. To them, the soldiers weren't just liberators. They were proof that decency still existed in the world. The camp's guard detachment had fled hours earlier, leaving chaos behind. Food stores were nearly empty. Dead bodies lay near the fence where the last roll call had been held. The medics worked quickly, sorting the living from the dying, setting up triage tents using parachute cloth and blankets taken from nearby houses. Outside the wire, soldiers radioed back. Civilians, all female, hundreds of them, malnourished, immediate aid required. Command didn't need convincing. Within hours, trucks rolled in carrying rations, medical supplies, and field nurses. When night fell, fires burned for warmth, not destruction. Soldiers boiled water in steel helmets, filled buckets, and brought them into the barracks. The women washed their faces for the first time in months. The scent of soap mixed with smoke and wet earth. Some began to hum, fragments of songs from home. One nurse wrote later, "It wasn't the food that made us cry. It was the soap. It meant we were human again." Across the ocean, a similar scene unfolded in the Philippines. On February 23, 1945, American paratroopers and Filipino guerrillas launched the daring Los Baños raid, descending from the sky at dawn. Within minutes, they surrounded the Japanese guards and freed more than 2,000 Allied civilians and nurses, many on the brink of death. Eyewitnesses recalled how the women hesitated to leave their huts, afraid it was a trick. When they saw the American flags on uniforms, disbelief turned to tears. Soldiers carried them out in blankets, handed them soap and water, and said softly, "You're safe now." Whether in the mud of Bavaria or the jungles of Luzon, the moment was the same. Liberation wrapped in disbelief. The world's most powerful armies had come not just with rifles and tanks, but with something gentler, a towel, a gesture, a restoration of dignity. And yet, liberation brought its own test. The human cost revealed in those camps would haunt the soldiers who entered them and redefine what victory meant. The news spread quickly through the ranks. The camps are real. We've seen them. Word reached headquarters within hours. Commanders ordered every available medic and field kitchen toward the liberated zones. Photographers followed, documenting the scenes for military archives. What they captured would later become the world's first glimpse of systematic cruelty on such a scale. In Germany, American units pressed deeper, uncovering smaller women's sub-camps scattered near Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Ravensbrück. Each was the same story told in different suffering. Prisoners too weak to walk were carried out on stretchers made from doors and fence boards. Some clung to the hands of their rescuers, refusing to let go even after being told they were safe. Inside one camp, soldiers found a barrack filled with children born to prisoners. infants wrapped in torn uniforms, cared for by mothers who had hidden them from guards. The soldiers stood speechless. One medic, barely 21, wrote in his notebook, "I thought I came to fight Germans. Instead, I found humanity buried alive." The liberation was not without danger. Some guards, refusing surrender, fired on approaching Allied troops. Skirmishes broke out near camp perimeters. In Ravensbrück, chaos erupted when SS officers tried to flee disguised among prisoners. American and Soviet forces, converging from opposite directions, occasionally collided in confusion. But amid the tension, the mission remained clear: save whoever could still be saved. In the Pacific, the Los Baños raid became a symbol of precision and courage. Paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division dropped behind enemy lines at dawn, coordinating with guerrilla forces who attacked simultaneously from the ground. The operation was executed in under 20 minutes. Not a single prisoner was left behind. When the women were evacuated, the Americans gave them water and clean cloths. One survivor later described holding a towel as, "The first time I remembered I was a person." She had been a nurse captured in 1942, surviving 3 years of captivity. "We had no mirrors," she said. "When I saw my reflection in the water, I didn't recognize her, but I knew she was free." As night fell over both continents, soldiers gathered around fires, listening to the quiet breathing of those they had saved. There were no cheers, no victory speeches, only silence broken by the rustle of blankets and the distant echo of artillery. In their reports, officers avoided emotional language, but the meaning was clear. These women had endured the war's hidden front. One fought not with weapons, but with endurance and dignity. In the days that followed, medical teams moved in. Prisoners were deloused, treated for malnutrition, and given identification tags. Chaplains conducted brief ceremonies for the dead, while survivors whispered prayers in their native tongues. Some asked for mirrors, others simply for a place to sleep without fear. The act of offering soap and towels became more than kindness. It was a ritual of cleansing, a symbolic break from the inhumanity that had defined their existence. The soldiers, hardened by battle, found themselves moved in ways they could not explain. War had trained them to destroy. Liberation taught them how to restore. And as trucks rolled out of the camps, carrying women wrapped in blankets, the soldiers watched silently, knowing that what they had seen would never leave them. The gates of the camps closed behind them, but the memory stayed open forever. When the war ended, liberation didn't mean peace. Not for those who had lived through the camps. Many of the rescued women were too weak to travel. Allied hospitals overflowed with survivors suffering from exhaustion, starvation, and trauma that had no medical name yet. In makeshift wards, American and British nurses worked beside former prisoners who insisted on helping others before resting themselves. One nurse from Ravensbrück, weighing barely 80 pounds, refused to stay in bed. "They helped me live," she said. "Now I will help them." The Allies set up displaced persons camps, temporary shelters for millions who had nowhere to return. Inside, survivors were fed, clothed, and registered. For the first time, they could write their names freely. Some wrote letters to families who would never read them. Others sat for hours, staring at the horizon, waiting for someone who would never come. Military photographers continued documenting everything. Not just the horror, but the recovery. Images showed women brushing their hair, smiling faintly, walking under open skies. The same soldiers who once fought through ruined cities now carried sewing kits and soap, helping women mend their clothes. Psychologists later noted that small acts, washing, dressing, eating at a table, played a vital role in reclaiming identity. Liberation was not a single event. It was a long, fragile process of becoming human again. In the months that followed, testimonies began to surface. At first, they were quiet. Whispers between survivors, fragments of memory too painful to share. But when Allied investigators began compiling war crime evidence, those whispers became the backbone of justice. At the Nuremberg trials, survivors stood before the world and described what had been done. Their voices trembled, but they did not break. One woman from a medical experiment unit spoke of watching her friends die from untreated infections. Another described sewing uniforms for SS officers, too weak to lift the needle. Their words filled the courtroom with a silence heavier than any explosion. Even hardened prosecutors struggled to maintain composure. The testimonies turned the unseen crimes into undeniable truth. Reporters from America and Britain wrote about these women, not as statistics, but as symbols of endurance. Newspapers called them the witnesses of conscience. Magazines published portraits of their faces, pale, tired, yet unyielding. Still, many survivors preferred anonymity. They feared being pitied or misunderstood. Some emigrated to the United States, Canada, or Israel, starting new lives under new names. Others returned to their ruined hometowns, searching for traces of the past, a photograph, a grave, a familiar street. For them, liberation had not erased the memories. It had only given them space to breathe again. In one poignant account, a survivor wrote, "The war ended, but I still woke up at night listening for the boots. I still folded my bread into 4 pieces, afraid it would run out." Allied soldiers, too, carried invisible scars. Many wrote home describing the sights they couldn't forget. A U.S. sergeant who entered Dachau told his wife, "I came here a soldier. I'm leaving a witness." Decades later, those letters would become part of museum exhibits, reminders that liberation was both an ending and a beginning. By 1946, aid organizations like the Red Cross, UNRWA, and countless volunteer nurses continued caring for survivors. Rebuilding required not just food and shelter, but trust, something easily lost and painfully rebuilt. In one camp in southern Germany, children of survivors drew pictures for their caretakers: houses, flowers, and birds. None drew fences. The war had destroyed nations, but within those quiet post-war hospitals and refugee tents, something was reborn. The belief that dignity could survive even the darkest night. As the years passed, the women who survived those camps became living testaments to endurance. Some spoke publicly. Others stayed silent for decades. But whether through words, art, or quiet resilience, they preserved the truth that humanity could never again afford to forget. In 1947, memorial projects began across Europe. The first plaques at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Belsen were simple. No grand speeches, just engraved stones with the words, "Never again." Former prisoners gathered around them, holding hands in silence. They did not celebrate victory. They remembered survival. For many, rebuilding life was harder than surviving the camp. Families were gone, homes destroyed, jobs scarce, yet they worked, studied, and raised children who would one day learn their mother's stories from yellowed letters and fading photographs. In Japan, American nurses returned home after years of captivity. The Angels of Bataan became national heroes, honored for their courage and professionalism under impossible conditions. Some wrote memoirs detailing how compassion and discipline kept them alive. Their stories reshaped how the world understood women in war, not as bystanders, but as participants and survivors. In Germany and Eastern Europe, female survivors joined post-war reconstruction efforts. Many became teachers, doctors, or human rights activists. One former Ravensbrück prisoner helped found an international committee to preserve the camp as a historical site. When asked why, she said, "Because people forget too easily, and forgetting is the beginning of repetition." The world's understanding of war crimes changed because of these women. Their testimonies shaped the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which formally outlawed medical experiments and demanded humane treatment for prisoners of war. In a way, Their suffering rewrote the laws of humanity. But remembrance was never simple. For years, survivors faced disbelief. Some were told to move on, while others felt their stories were too dark for polite conversation. Only in the 1960s and 70s did historians and filmmakers begin to revisit their experiences. With the depth they deserved, documentaries and museums gradually shifted, focus from generals and battles to the voices of individuals, the civilians, nurses, and prisoners who endured war's hidden front lines. In those exhibits, photographs of the liberated women stood beside letters written in trembling handwriting. "We are free, but I don't yet know what that means." For later generations, these accounts became lessons, not just about history, but about human nature. The idea that civilization itself depends on memory, that silence, when it meets cruelty, becomes complicity. In modern Germany, school children still visit Ravensbrück. In the Philippines, the story of the Angels of Bataan is taught as a chapter of bravery. Across the US and Europe, Memorial Days are observed each spring to honor those who were liberated from concentration and internment camps. At these ceremonies, survivors, now frail and stooped, sometimes wear the same faded scarves or badges they once wore in the camps. When they speak, their voices tremble with age, but remain steady with purpose. One woman said, "We were not heroes. We were witnesses. The heroes are the ones who listened." As decades turned into generations, the black and white photographs from 1945 gained new meaning. To some, they were history. To others, warnings. Every wrinkle, every scar, every quiet smile in those pictures told the same story. That even in the most inhuman conditions, humanity endured. In the early 2000s, historians digitized thousands of liberation photos and diaries. Each image was labeled with a name, a date, and a place, so that no one would ever again be just a number. Some of the women's descendants, now in their 50s or 60s, stood in front of computer screens weeping as they saw their mothers' faces for the first time. The legacy of the liberated women is not just one of tragedy. It is a reminder of strength, of the courage to live on when life itself seemed impossible. Their story continues to echo in every humanitarian law, in every nurse who runs toward danger, in every survivor who chooses to tell the truth. Because history is not just written by victors, it is preserved by survivors. And as long as their voices are remembered, the world can never truly return to the darkness they endured. Dawn, a quiet field outside a camp that no longer exists. The fog drifts through the ruins of barbed wire and concrete foundations. Grass has begun to reclaim the earth where thousands once suffered. There are no guards now, no uniforms, only silence, and the faint sound of birds returning after years of absence. It is hard to imagine that this place once defined the edge of humanity, that the same soil now covered in dew once held so much pain. But this is where the story of the women ends, not in despair, but in renewal. When American soldiers handed them soap and towels, it was not charity. It was recognition, an unspoken message that said, "You are human again." In that moment, war's machinery met something it could not destroy: compassion. Those small gestures became symbols far greater than their simplicity. They marked the point where brutality met mercy, where liberation became more than the opening of gates. It became the restoration of identity. In the decades that followed, the world built monuments, wrote laws, and held trials. But the true victory was quieter, found in the laughter of children born to survivors, in the rebuilt homes, in the classrooms where their stories are still told. Each survivor carried the war within them, but they also carried the proof that kindness, even in war, is powerful enough to outlast hatred. If history teaches anything, it is this: weapons can end battles, but humanity ends wars. And so, when we look at those black and white photographs, The women standing barefoot, wrapped in blankets, faces thin but eyes alive. We are not just looking at victims. We are looking at witnesses who stepped out of darkness carrying light. Their story is not just about what they endured. It's about what they reclaimed. Dignity, identity, and the right to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. The gates of the camps have long been closed, but the meaning of their liberation still walks among us.